Some news coming in now. The Jacob Zuma stay of arrest application has been dismissed by the Pietermaritzburg High Court, which essentially means that former President Jacob Zuma will be spending this weekend in prison. And in anticipation of the other court case that is pending, and it will be heard by the same court on Monday, the 12th of July, with regards to the stay of the suspended sentence, or rather the suspension of the constitutional court sentence. And we now go back to Ayanda Mhlongo, who is outside the Pietermaritzburg High Court. Ayanda, a very good morning to you. Over to you. Now, please tell us exactly what happened and what the judgment is and what it means.
A very good morning to you once again, Simpio, and good morning to our viewers. Well, that was very, very brief. Simpio, as you know that today's judgment was going to be delivered virtually by Judge Bekisisa Mnguni, and us as the SABC team were actually outside the court trying to monitor that virtual judgment by the judge. So very, very briefly, the judge just only saying that the application by former President Jacob Zuma has been dismissed. Now, of course, we know that this was filed by his legal team in the hope to prevent him being imprisoned. Obviously, now that he is behind bars, what they were hoping was that should the court have ruled in his favor, this could have possibly meant that he would then at least spend the weekend at home while he awaits Monday's hearing in the Constitutional Court, where he has filed a rescission application. So disappointment for former President Jacob Zuma will mean that he will have to remain in prison, and now his hopes will be on the Constitutional Court and whether or not they could possibly reverse that judgment, who could then see him go home. So, as I said, Simpio, what we also just to give our viewers briefly what is happening here outside the court as well. The road, in fact, just outside the Pietermaritzburg High Court has been closed off. There's a heavy police deployment outside the court, and this was an anticipation of the supporters of the former president, which were expected to come out here today and show their support for him. You remember that on Tuesday there was a small group of supporters that had actually converged here outside the Pietermaritzburg High Court, and so law enforcement agencies leaving nothing to chance, as the minister was saying, Minister Bekisisa was saying, and his briefing to members of the media earlier on today, that there is indeed a large deployment of police officers here in the province of KwaZulu-Natal, and they've been placed in strategic areas, which would be in areas around Durban, Stanger, KwaDukuza, Empangeni, where there has been road blockades this morning and protests, but also here in Pietermaritzburg in anticipation of today's judgment, but also focused in the Escourt area around the Escourt Correctional Facility. At this point, there has not been any supporters that have come out here. Seemingly, could it mean that they are now adhering to the lockdown regulations, that there are no gatherings that are permitted, of course, in light of what happened yesterday with the arrest of the spokesperson of Umkhonto we Sizwe military veterans, Carl House. But certainly where we are, there has not been any supporters of the former president. In fact, just driving into Pietermaritzburg as well, relatively quiet, no scenes, no blockades, no protests taking place in this area. But a blow to former President Jacob Zuma, who had hoped that had the Pietermaritzburg High Court ruled in his favor, he would have possibly been able to go home for at least the weekend or the next week, depending on the decision that will be made by the Constitutional Court. Simpira?
And a very brief judgment it was, and we still haven't gotten hold of that judgment. But from what you've gathered there on the ground, what were the reasons did Judge Mnguni give? I mean, in consideration of the fact that there is another case pending which will affect the fate of former President Jacob Zuma, that of the rescission of sentence on Monday. What were the reasons, if perhaps you were privy to them?
At this point, Simpiwe, no. We have been standing outside the court because the judgment was going to be virtual, so we have not had an opportunity to see what the reasons for the dismissal of this application were. But you'd note that on Tuesday, when the matter was being heard, there were long deliberations by, Advocate Dalimpofu, representing former President Jacob Zuma, but also then Advocate Toby and the Hello Nsuzman Foundation, which also argued that this court does not have the jurisdiction to rule on the matter, and that as a lower court, the Pietermaritzburg High Court could not interfere in a decision of the higher court, being the constitutional court. And we will be updating our viewers once we've got a hand of that judgment as to what were the reasons that led to Judge Bekisisa Mnguni at rejecting former President Jacob Zuma's application. Of course, we've said a lot of this happening here in the province of KwaZulu-Natal. Let's now go to Escourt, where my colleague Jadely Posa is standing by.
Well, thank you, Ayanda. Here on the ground in Escourt, fairly quite a blow indeed. Very disappointing to hear that former President Jacob Zuma will spend the weekend inside Escourt Correctional Facility as he awaits the Constitution now as his last bid to try and be released from this prison. But on the grounds, very quiet here. We haven't seen any supporters flocking to showcase their support for former President Jacob Zuma. Very quiet compared to yesterday, where we saw large gatherings, large group led by Carl Niehaus stationed outside here. We suppose that this could possibly change. You know, the story is always developing and always changing at the hour, that there will be supporters based outside Escourt, pro-Zuma supporters, ANC members who are disgruntled and angry at the outcomes of that Pietermaritzburg High Court ruling, citing that former President Jacob Zuma will have to remain behind bars for now. Another interesting fact that has come out in this morning, or claims rather, that has come out during our interaction here on the ground, is there has been some claims that there are inmates who are starving themselves at the Escourt correctional facilities. I'm just going to walk out of shot and just let Rasta behind the camera show you some of the security personnel that are stationed outside here, making sure that all is in order. But there were these claims that the inmates are starving themselves. There are riots happening behind closed doors, obviously pro-Zuma supporters inside. I did phone the correctionals department spokesperson Singabaka Nxumalo, who has refuted these claims, saying that this is indeed fake news. We've seen these allegations and claims being surfaced on social media, on Twitter and on Facebook, as that Free Zuma protest continues around KwaZulu-Natal, where we've seen so many protests happening in Pietermaritzburg, in Durban in particular, and we assume that these are some of the claims that are on the ground. So right now it's fairly quiet, Ayanda and Simpiwe, but we'll bring you all the latest developments on the ground as we play out the scenes across KwaZulu-Natal. Simpiwe, it's back to you.
All right, Jadely, thank you so much for joining us. We'll continue monitoring developments coming out of Escourt, wherein we do understand, as Jadely mentioned, that there aren't any supporters, and I would imagine the disappointment on the supporters' faces with regards to the recent news that the application for the stay of arrest has been dismissed by the Pietermaritzburg High Court, essentially meaning that former President Zuma will spend this weekend in jail, and hoping, of course, that his fortunes will change on Monday, when the same court, the same Pietermaritzburg High Court, will be delivering a judgment on the rescission of sentence.